I know it might be hard to believe today, but there was a time when a group of wealthy businessmen in America secretly schemed to take control of American politics. The only problem they had was they weren't very good at it yet. The business plot, also dubbed the Wall Street Putsch or the Smedley Butler Coup, was an attempt by a group of financiers to rally disenfranchised veterans to literally march on Washington, oust then-President Franklin Roosevelt, and then replace him with retired Marine General Smedley Butler, who would act as a temporary dictator just to get the company back on track, because that always ends so well. The only problem with this plan, though, was the man who the financiers wanted at the center of it. It turned out that even though he did not personally believe in a lot of Roosevelt's politics, a highly decorated World War I Marine general was, something of a patriot. He immediately exposed the plan to reporters, and later, before Congress, in a testimony that went absolutely nowhere. Despite being potentially one of the most openly treasonous conspiracies against America ever, nobody was criminally charged, and the men involved got to live out their lives with their wealth and reputations intact. Now, the details of the story itself are crazy enough, and they can give us some unique insights into just how unhinged politics really was back then. But beyond that, something that is even more interesting is the context that motivated one of the most genuine attempts at a coup d'etat in modern American history.
I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations.
There is an old saying used by doctors that you keep on poking until you find the spot that hurts. Now, that might not be board-certified medical advice, but in 1933, there was obviously something that made a group of wealthy businessmen so uneasy that they would risk being charged with treason to fix it. So what exactly was it that was making wealthy people, and Wall Street in particular, so angry at Roosevelt? Well, there were actually three things. Once you understand those, the story of how this all unfolded becomes even funnier, if not a little bit more concerningly relevant to today. The first thing is that all of this was happening in the wake of the Great Depression, the single most severe economic downturn in American history, and something that these very same financiers were largely responsible for. Before the Depression hit, the 1920s had been a golden age for American finance. The stock market was booming, credit was flowing freely, and wealthy investors were making fortunes on increasingly reckless speculation. When the bubble burst in 1929, the fallout was catastrophic. Banks failed by the thousands, unemployment hit 25%, and families that had been comfortable just years earlier were lining up for bread. The financiers who had fueled the speculation largely survived with their way of life intact. Their workers did not. By 1932, the country was desperate enough to do something it hadn't done in over a decade. Elect a Democrat in a landslide. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had won with a mandate to fix the mess, and he wasted absolutely no time. He came up with the New Deal, a sweeping package of reforms designed to put people back to work, regulate the financial system that had just blown up, and build a safety net for the millions of Americans who had fallen through the floor. It included public works programs, financial regulations, labor protections, and new agencies with enough power to actually enforce them. Now, to millions of ordinary Americans, this was a lifeline. Wall Street? They saw it as an act of war because the New Deal dared to even the playing field a bit. Labor unions gained legal protections, workers gained bargaining rights, and for the first time, the federal government was actively stepping in to control the speculation and financialization of everything that had gotten the country into the mess in the first place. Naturally, Wall Street was absolutely furious. Roosevelt was openly accused of being a socialist and having even more radical sympathies.
You're a suspected communist. I'm a New Deal Democrat. I said suspected.
That was the political climate, especially in the context of what was going on in Europe at the time. Support Roosevelt's reforms and you were one step away from marching alongside the Bolsheviks. So the New Deal was the most visible source of Wall Street's fury. But there was something else Roosevelt did that hit even closer to their wallets. In April 1933, just weeks into his presidency, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which just straight up made it illegal for American citizens to hold gold, outside of narrow exceptions for things like jewelry. Most people think that 1971 was the year America left the gold standard. The reality is that outside of very special exceptions for other national governments, it was 1933 that saw a greater restriction on individuals' ability to hold onto gold as a store of wealth. Americans were forced to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars at a fixed rate of $20.67 per ounce. Then, a year later, Roosevelt raised the official price of gold to $35 per ounce. Now, if you're thinking, so what? Think about what that meant for the people who had just been forced to hand over their gold at $20 an ounce. The government bought it at one price and then immediately revalued it upward by roughly 40%. The wealth that had been sitting in those gold reserves effectively transferred to the federal government overnight. For ordinary Americans in the midst of the Great Depression, who had no gold to give up, this was irrelevant. Most people were far too busy trying to find work to worry about the price of bullion. But for wealthy financiers who had significant gold reserves, this was, in their eyes, government-sanctioned theft. So then, why did he do it? Well, this might annoy the gold bugs, but the reasoning behind it was actually sound. Ditching the gold standard gave the government more flexibility to fight the Depression. Our friends Jory Shasford at Money and Macro and Economics Explained have both done far more detailed videos on why this was the case. But the TLDR is that balancing inflation, interest rates, employment, and national debt is hard enough without tying all those to fixed gold reserves and market prices. Moving towards a fiat currency for domestic operations meant that banks could be stabilized with money that didn't need physical gold to back it up. Inflation could be introduced to stop people hoarding what wealth they could, and instead encourage them to spend their money before it got devalued. Circulating money, in turn, would help the whole system get moving again. But despite the upsides to the broader economy, society-wide advantages don't make it feel any less like a robbery when the gold was yours. So, at this point, you had angry financiers watching their political influence get undercut by the New Deal, and their personal wealth get devalued by the gold seizure. But there was still one more thing, something that took people who were wealthy and angry and made them wealthy and angry and actually dangerous. They had a model that was already playing out across the Atlantic, where countries that had been just as, if not more, devastated by the Depression were finding a very different kind of solution. Benito Mussolini had taken power in Italy, crushed the labor unions, silenced political opposition, and handed enormous influence back to the industrialists who had funded his rise. And by most accounts, the Italian economy was stabilizing. Portugal under Salazar, Hungary under Horthy, Spain sliding in the same direction under Franco. And then, of course, even in 1933, it was possible to see the early signs of what was happening in Germany. Now the pattern was difficult to miss. In country after country, economic crises were pushing politics towards one of two extremes: authoritarian communism on the left or authoritarian fascism on the right. The Wall Street financiers obviously weren't fans of communism, and Roosevelt's New Deal looked uncomfortably close to it in their eyes. But fascism had some real appeal for wealthy industrialists. It crushed organized labor, it protected private property, at least for the right people, and it let businessmen call the shots instead of getting pushed around by regulators. And the thing is, it wasn't just that they found the idea attractive in theory. They were watching it work. Real countries with real economies recovering under systems that gave business the power that these Wall Street types felt they were losing at home. Mussolini had done it. He'd taken a broken economy and handed the keys to the industrialists who funded him. If you were a wealthy American sitting in a New York club watching your gold get seized and your workers unionize, that looked like a solution. Of course, we know now that these systems rarely worked long term, and we made an entire video last month about how Hitler in particular, in fact, did not save the German economy. But we can see that now with the benefit of hindsight. So you had a group of extremely wealthy, extremely angry men who had just watched their gold get seized, their power get threatened, and who could look across the ocean and see what appeared to be a working alternative playing out in real time. And that's the part of the story everyone basically agrees on, because what these men reportedly did next makes the rest of it look like a polite disagreement over tax policy. They didn't just complain at their clubs or write angry letters to senators. They went out and tried to organize an actual coup against the President of the United States. The man they chose to lead it, they could not have picked worse if they'd tried. So, it's time to learn how history works, and to find out what happened when Wall Street picked the wrong Marine to lead their coup. This video is sponsored by Masterclass. Masterclass just launched something that caught my attention: Masterclass Certificates. One of the programs they're offering is a certificate in AI fundamentals, designed to help professionals build practical AI skills they can actually use at work. AI fluency is quickly becoming the kind of skill that separates people who get ahead from people who get left behind. And the problem isn't that people don't want to learn it, it's that most of the resources out there are either too technical, too shallow, or taught by people who have never actually applied any of it. This certificate program is built by Masterclass and taught by people who are actually working with AI at high level right now. It's not passive video lectures, it's hands-on activities, real frameworks, and a final capstone project you can actually put in your portfolio. By the end, you'll learn how to redesign your workflows, make better decisions with AI, and actually apply it in your day-to-day life. That's the kind of edge that compounds over a career. Ready to future-proof your career? Explore the new Masterclass certificate in AI fundamentals and use my link to get 15% off. You can also scan the QR code on screen right now to get started. Major General Smedley Darlington Butler was, by any measure, one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. He had served in nearly every major conflict from the Spanish-American War through the First World War, earning 2 Medals of Honor along the way, which even in an era of frequent military engagement was almost unheard of. He was also, by the early 1930s, extremely popular with veterans. He spoke their language, he'd fought alongside them, and more importantly, he'd been very publicly fighting for them. In 1932, thousands of World War I veterans had marched on Washington, demanding early payment of the bonus certificate they'd been promised for their service. President Hoover's response was to send in the army to tear gas them and burn down their camps. Butler had been one of the loudest voices defending those veterans. He'd visited their encampments, spoken at their rallies, and publicly called out the government for treating its own soldiers like an enemy force. Now, from the financier's perspective, Butler looked like the perfect figurehead. Conservative, decorated, beloved by hundreds of thousands of angry veterans, and with every reason to resent the current political establishment. What they apparently didn't do was check what he'd actually been saying lately. The approach started in the summer of 1933. A bond salesman named Gerald Maguire, connected to some serious Wall Street money, reached out with what seemed at first like a pretty normal ask. Maguire wanted Butler to attend an upcoming American Legion convention and deliver a speech pushing for a return to the gold standard. A cause that happened to align perfectly with the financial interests of the people Maguire worked for. Butler was suspicious, but he listened. Over the following weeks, the requests got stranger. Maguire showed up with bank statements, serious money, millions. He'd started talking about trips he'd taken to Europe, where he'd personally studied how veterans' organizations had been used to back fascist movements in Italy and France. And Butler kept listening. Not because he agreed with any of it, but because he wanted to know how far these people were willing to go. Eventually, Maguire told Butler that a group of wealthy men wanted him to lead an army of 500,000 veterans in a march on Washington. Not entirely unlike what Mussolini had done in Italy a decade earlier, and reportedly the direct inspiration for the plan. The stated plan was to support the president by installing Butler as a so-called Secretary of General Affairs, a position that didn't exist, and one that would effectively make him a dictator operating alongside Roosevelt. Roosevelt would remain as a figurehead. Butler and the financiers behind him would actually run the country, because that always works out exactly as planned. So by now, you're probably thinking that Butler acquiesced and did exactly what the financiers wanted, right? Well, not at all. He went straight to the press. Not quietly, not politely, just straight to a journalist named Paul Comely French, who independently confirmed several details of Maguire's story. And then Butler went to Congress. In November 1934, he testified before the McCormack-Dick-Stein Committee, a congressional body investigating so-called un-American activities, and laid out the entire conspiracy in detail. He named names, he described meetings, he explained the plan from start to finish. The committee investigated, they interviewed witnesses. They found Butler's testimony credible. And then, nothing happened. No one was arrested, no one was charged, no one went to trial. The committee's final report acknowledged that evidence of a conspiracy existed, but the men behind it were never held accountable. Now, there were a few reasons for this. First, Butler blew the whistle so fast that the conspirators never actually got far enough to incriminate themselves. There was no army assembled, no march, no written orders, just meetings and promises that any lawyer could squint at and call casual political discussion. So no smoking gun. Second, and this is where it gets legally weird, treason has very specific standards in the United States. Extreme political views? Not a crime. Wanting to overthrow the government? Still not technically illegal. You actually need concrete action, and the conspirators had been careful enough to stay on the legal side of that line right up until the moment they needed Butler to step over it. They were careful. Third, and yeah, this one's the worst part. The men behind the plot were some of the richest, most connected people in America. Prosecuting them would have been a complete disaster during an economy that was already on life support. Roosevelt made a calculation. Let it die quietly rather than drag the country through a treason trial that could spook an economy that was barely starting to recover. Whether that was pragmatism or cowardice depends on who you ask. Now, the financiers chose Butler because they believed he was one of them, a decorated conservative who had spent his career in service to American power. If they had actually listened to what Butler had been saying in the years before the plot, they would have heard something very different. For most of his career, Butler had been exactly the kind of man they wanted. He fought in the Philippines, in China, in Honduras, Haiti, Nicaragua. Wherever American corporate interests needed a military presence, Smedley Butler showed up. But somewhere along the way, he started asking who exactly he'd been fighting for. By the late 1920s, Butler had begun publicly questioning whether America's foreign interventions were really about democracy, or whether they were about making sure United Fruit kept its plantations and Standard Oil kept its drilling rights. By the early 1930s, that questioning had turned into outright denunciation. He called himself a racketeer for capitalism and a high-class muscle man for Wall Street, arguing that for 33 years he had basically been an enforcer for banks and big business, dressed up in a Marine uniform. His rhetoric by 1933 was arguably further to the left than Roosevelt's own. He was denouncing capitalism, calling out bankers by name and demanding that the working people who actually fought the wars see a fair share of the wealth those wars had created. And despite being a lifelong Republican, Butler had actually supported Roosevelt in the 1932 election. So the financiers had picked the one decorated war hero in America who had already decided that men exactly like them were the problem. There's an argument that if Butler had been less of a patriot and more of an opportunist, if he'd actually gone along with the plan and been installed as this temporary dictator, he may well have ended up more hostile to the financiers' interests than Roosevelt ever was. They didn't just pick the wrong man, they picked their own worst nightmare. After the hearings faded from the news, Roosevelt went on to become the longest-serving president in American history. He pulled the country through the rest of the Depression, he led America through the Second World War, he built the institutions that would create the largest middle class the world had ever seen. And perhaps the most ironic part, economic recovery that followed actually made the men who tried to overthrow him wealthier than they had been before. The regulations they hated, the unions they feared, the New Deal they tried to destroy, all of it helped build the most broadly prosperous economy in American history. The post-war boom lifted everyone, including the very financiers who had been so terrified of Roosevelt's reforms that they were willing to risk treason to stop him. They were wrong, and they got rich anyway. The business plot is often treated as a footnote, a bizarre episode that didn't go anywhere and therefore doesn't matter. But the reason it matters has nothing to do with whether the plot succeeded. It's what it reveals about the conditions that produce these kinds of conspiracies. A group of extremely wealthy people, threatened by reforms designed to help ordinary citizens, looked across the Atlantic at authoritarian movements and thought, yeah, that could work here. They didn't see fascism as a warning, they saw it as a business model. The fact that they failed doesn't change the fact that they tried. And the fact that nobody was punished is itself part of the story. If you want to see what happened when that playbook actually succeeded, go watch our video on Mussolini, because the plan the Wall Street conspirators were following didn't come from nowhere. It was already running in real time in Rome. And it showed exactly how a movement could ride economic pain into power, crush institutions, and sell control as national renewal. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.